I guess in 40 minutes you know. So yeah, my name, you still know it, you still can read it. My friends call me Božo, in case somebody is wondering. I'm still from Sofia, Bulgaria, this magical city. And this time I actually have a small announcement of mine to make. After me coming to RubyConf in Minsk for 4 times, I think, no, 3 times, I invite you to the very first Ruby conference in Bulgaria, Balkan Ruby. It is going to take place more or less 1 month from now. It is going to be awesome because, believe it or not, we have way more sun, way more drinks. We have an amazing keynote speaker who doesn't know this yet, but he's going to be preparing a brand new talk. So even if you see him today, there's still going to be something there for you. He's going to be buying you Bulgarian rakia all the time. It's going to be exciting. Plus, Nick is also going to stop giving talks about Trailblazer because my company recently open sourced a competitor to Trailblazer. Normally, I would have given a talk about it, but we were very lazy and we didn't document it at all. So it's not usable by humans, only by hackers at this point. But I can tell you it's really amazing and it kind of works. So, I assume that next time we meet, you might be hearing the first talk about Granite. It's a cool thingy. In the meantime, I've still been doing open source, blah, 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 blah. Something interesting. And I'm very, very exciting. And I'm very, very excited that here, especially for you, I'll be giving a brand new talk that I haven't given anywhere else. Funny enough, even though RuboCop is my most successful open source project, I have never said a single word about it, I think, anywhere. So I guess it's high time we change this. With no further ado, all about RuboCop. So in case somebody here doesn't know what RuboCop is, in a nutshell, it's the following. Number 1, Ruby static code analyzer that is, at least originally was aimed to enforce the community Ruby style guide, which translated into human language means something like it keeps your code base consistent, it saves you time, because otherwise you would have to manually keep your code base consistent, and it advances the Ruby language forward. People are kind of puzzled by this bold statement, but because of its widespread use, we can count on RuboCop to discourage some questionable Ruby practices, so that those features can eventually be removed relatively safely from the language. And we can also promote the usage of more modern, better practices, and we can be reasonably certain that those are going to be adopted very, very fast. For instance, I'm certain that without RuboCop, the vast majority of Ruby programmers wouldn't have ever heard about the newer version of here doc documents, which automatically strips the indentation and so on. So it is really doing something useful for you, but also something useful for the Ruby ecosystem. It's not all perfect. It doesn't work very well for various reasons, most notably because in a dynamic language like Ruby, go figure out what foo is and what exactly this each method is. So it is very hard for us in certain situations to figure out whether the piece of code we are trying to analyze is the thingy that we are looking for or something else that looks like the thingy that we are looking for. And this leads to a lot of false positives here and there, but it is what it is. Those are the trade-offs of working with a dynamic language. It also doesn't seem to be doing all the things you want or to be doing them exactly right, because when I was writing this presentation, we had exactly 314 open issues, which is an interesting number because it got me started. If I find 100 volunteers and they fix 3.14 issues each, is this a coincidence or providence? I think it's providence, and I think that here I see my first batch of volunteers. So go find your pi number of issues on the issue tracker and start having fun. Also, Nick yesterday asked me to put this disclaimer to my talk that RuboCop is not going to fix your shitty code. He told me, people should know that before they ran RuboCop, they had a shitty code base, and afterwards they had a prettier shitty code base, but it's still shit. I'm quoting Nick verbatim. He's a man known for the eloquence, whatever, some fancy English word. But you'll see this in action. Nick is awesome. Okay, so what can I tell you about RuboCop that you probably didn't know? I remember when I was younger, I was reading some book which had some fancy quote, "You don't know where you're going until you know where you've been." And this stuck with me for my entire life. That's why I really like telling stories, mostly stories about the past of some software projects to people like you at conferences around the world. I cannot really tell you a brief history of time. I'm not qualified or smart enough, but I can tell you a brief history of RuboCop and how we ended up being here. RuboCop's history began in 2011 when I started work on the Ruby style guide. There was a ticket filed by Jean Mertz, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, where he suggested that the guide is great, there is a lot of wisdom there, but it is so huge that nobody can remember the rules, and it becomes very time-consuming to be trying to get a code base aligned with the style guide. So he said, why don't we develop a code style checker like the numerous Python tools that exist out there? And it seemed like a good idea to me, but there were several problems. Number one, I didn't know anything about static code analysis. Number two, I had never authored a Ruby library. Number three, and most importantly, I had absolutely no idea where to begin. So this was strange. I was just a regular run-of-the-mill Ruby on Rails developer. I knew how to write controllers, models, a bit of CSS, horrible. But that was the extent of my expertise in 2011. Fortunately for me, the company I was working for quickly hit the ground. Our business was rapidly collapsing. I had absolutely nothing to do in my workplace in May 2012. So I decided to use the money of my employees to fund an open source project. And that's how RuboCop 000 was born. So I'm not joking. The initial version of RuboCop was really 000 because I didn't really know how to deploy gems. And I didn't see that there was some metadata I was supposed to edit before pushing the deploy button. This was kind of lame, as was the initial release of RuboCop. I told you I didn't know anything about static code analysis, so I decided to analyze code the way I do it best, with regular expressions. Needless to say, this didn't work out very well, and I'm very skilled with analyzing code with regular expressions because this is how all editors like Vim and Tmax do it. All of the major code editing mode have a huge pile of regular expressions that they're using to interpret the code. I tried for a while, but for a while I got very depressed. I found a new job. I got buried with work, and I was supposed to show this slide, which I forgot. But anyways, and RuboCop seemed like something that was going to be quickly forgotten. But the situation changed surprisingly in November later this year, where Jonas came along. Jonas, for the people who are familiar with RuboCop's development, is the second most prolific RuboCop developer in the history of RuboCop. But back in the day, he was the person who opened the very first pull request for RuboCop. Somehow, he found my gem, which does nothing. He wrote that it seemed like something useful, which worried me about his assessment of usability. The first thing he decided to implement was Emacs integration. So I really liked the guy because, as you know, Emacs is the one true editor that is going to bring balance to the source. Jonas started occasionally filing some pull requests. He created a few more code checks. And I got thinking, maybe we can still turn this project around. Plus, this was helped by the fact that in the spring of 2013, my next company was about to go bankrupt, and I have nothing to do. It seemed that I was going to be fired pretty soon, so I decided to use my employer's money wisely and invest them in open source. This time around, I wanted to do things right. So I did a bit of research about the state of Ruby parsers at the time. All of the parsers that existed were incompatible with Ruby 1.9 for some reason. And this left as the only candidate the Reaper parser, which is built in Ruby 1.9 and newer. This is derived from the real parser that MRI uses. I learned everything I could learn about Reaper, which required a lot of experimentation because Reaper has zero documentation. And all the knowledge in the world about Reaper at the time was 3 blog posts, something like this. Basically, Hello World of Parsing. But I'm a stubborn guy. And in the span of a relatively little time, I released many versions of RuboCop. Once again, I didn't cut 10 releases on the 17th of April. I again forgot that I was supposed to be changing the release date of the gem manually in whatever gem cutter I was using at the time. So this actually happened over the span of 1 month, but still plenty of releases. It was really fun to see something meaningful come out of nothing. Very quickly, I wrote something like 50 cops for RuboCop, and it became something really useful for me, and I assume useful for other people. But it was also extremely frustrating, mostly because of certain shortcomings and limitations of Reaper. Number one, Reaper at the time supported just MRI. Supposedly, they were going to port this to JRuby as well at some time. I have absolutely no idea whether this happened or not. But also at the time, it seemed that Rubinius was going places. And ideally, I wanted to build some cross-platform tool that was going to be working on all the major Rubies, which Reaper was obviously not suitable for. Also, Reaper had an extremely frustrating representation of the abstract syntax tree of the code. Let me show this to you. Basically, the AST in Reaper is just an array of nested arrays. It doesn't seem very bad when you see it like this, but when you have to write code manipulating this AST, it usually looks like this. A lot of nested array referencing. You can obviously write some higher level API on top of this, but I keep wondering if the parser can't provide you a meaningful AST, what exactly is it providing you? Also, it had many quirks in the lexing logic. For instance, when you lex one keyword, like one, you see that symbol beginning followed by identifier. And this looks nice. When you lex alias, you see symbol beginning followed by a keyword, which I kind of understand the reasoning behind, because also alias is a keyword in Ruby, but in this context, it is undoubtedly an identifier. So why does the Lexer treat it as a keyword? I have no idea. That the same things happens with methods who are named the same way as keywords. This is very frustrating. I was complaining about this for a while to the Ruby maintainers, but they told me, it's supposed to work like this. We are not fixing it. Go figure out some other way to deal with this. And I didn't really want to figure out a different way to do it because I was, as I told you, really, really frustrated. Then another guy, Magnus Holm, commented to one of the tickets where I was venting my frustration that maybe I should check out this brand new parser named very inspiringly Parser, which supported Ruby 1.9 and supposedly was amazing. I was like, okay, Reaper is so bad that I can hardly imagine something being worse than Reaper. I went to read a little bit about Parser, and it seemed like something really, really promising to me. Parser was cross-platform by design, and it even worked with platforms that I didn't consider targeting, like Mac Ruby, which was a meaningful project back in the day, doesn't exist now, CodeMotion, and so on. Parser was well documented, or at least the README said it was well documented. The documentation looks something like this for the various AST nodes. I know it doesn't seem like much, but something is infinitely better than nothing. So compared with Reaper, I guess you can say that it was very well documented. Sorry about this. Allergies. The AST format was really easy to work with because it wasn't just a bunch of nested arrays. It was represented something like this visually, so you can quickly see that a method invocation in Ruby translates to a send node in the AST with 2 integer nodes and 1 literal operator plus. For people who are not familiar with parsers, it might look like something very cryptic, but trust me, it doesn't get better than this. Furthermore, it was really easy in Parser to create mappings between the IST nodes and the locations in the source code, which for a static code analysis is very important because you want to ideally be highlighting the offending code so people would understand what they're supposed to fix. When you parse a bit of code with Parser, you can see that there are locations attached to every element. For instance, a method invocation has a dot, but here, because we're using a special syntax, the dot is nil. It has a beginning and an end. This is the opening and closing parentheses of a method invocation, but here we don't have them. It has a selector, which is the name of the method, basically, and it has an expression, which is the whole thing, 2 plus 2. Once again, it might not seem like much to you, but this is exactly what I needed to create the fancy offense highlighting in RuboCop, and this is also the basis of the autocorrect feature, because you have to know what segment of the code you want to be replacing with something else. So pretty useful. To give you an idea how all of this fits together, if you parse a piece of code, this is its AST, and this is how the ranges from the previous slide correspond to the various segments. So this is the selector of the send. This is the send expression, 2 plus 2. This is the first integer node, 2, and this is its highlighting. This is the second integer node, and this is its highlighting. A bit obscure, but very useful for 2 writers. Also, as I mentioned, Parser had accounted for the possibility that somebody would want to alter the code that they parsed. And this is the basis for the autocorrection feature. Without Parser, it would have never crossed my mind to display offenses and autocorrect them. But Parser was not without its shortcomings. It wasn't like using it was just rainbows and unicorns. I had plenty of struggles with Parser as well. Like, it was brand new, which is kind of good, but it meant that it had really no users, and it had plenty of bugs which were waiting for me to uncover. I think I reported all of those bugs just in the first month of me using Parser, and generally this happened like this. I would release some new RuboCop. Some users would be parsing some obscure Ruby syntax that I didn't even know existed, and we will be improving the parsing capabilities of Parser. This is also how I became uniquely familiar with all the corners and dark places in Ruby, and this is why I keep complaining so much that we have to make the language simpler, because it's fucking ridiculously complex. Anyways, on the 28th of May 2013, we reached the biggest milestone in the history of RuboCop. Then I had finished rewriting the project completely from Reaper to Parser, and we reached what I considered the state of unity, the point of no return, the point from which it would be significantly easier to extend RuboCop further. A few weeks later, I released the final major update to RuboCop 0.9. In this release, we introduced the concept of custom formatting for the output, and you can display the format in something like 20 different ways. Provide your own. This is where we introduced autocorrection, and from there it was just adding more and more checks, more sophisticated checks, and working on some improvements to the internals that didn't really concern end users much, like Commissioner. Originally, RuboCop was working in the following manner. Every cop would fully parse every source file and process it, which was ridiculously inefficient. We switched to a model where we would be parsing the AST just once, and while walking it, we are triggering all the cops. This resulted in a massive speed boost. Then we decided that it is pretty wise to just cache the results from every linting, so we wouldn't have to recheck the entire code base every time. Basically, we create a mapping between the hash of a file and the offenses it produced and the configuration you had when you were running RuboCop. So we are reasonably certain that nothing material could have changed. And if this matches the current run, we are not checking anything at all. This made RuboCop like a few hundred times faster when the cache is present. But this wasn't enough, so we also added parallel execution. And eventually, I think that RuboCop became fast enough. I told you about my fondness for regular expressions, so at a certain point, we developed a pattern matching library for AST nodes, which we inspiringly named pattern matching. It allowed us to simplify code like this. This is how basically you work with Parser. You get some node, you decompose it into its child nodes, and you run some checks here. Do we have a receiver, meaning something on which we're invoking some method? Is this receiver of a certain type, here an array? Is the method we are invoking on the receiver something? Does it have a certain type of arguments? It doesn't seem complex, and it's not really, but with the pattern matching library, we managed to compress it to this. You define the pattern that you're looking for in the IST, which our custom DSL, and then the entire code becomes a one-liner. It is pretty powerful, and I think that this is something that many other libraries could benefit from. We have been talking with the team to extract it in another library, and I know that one of the contributors have been working on this, but it hasn't happened yet. Anyways, so much about the history. I want to speak a little bit about what we have today and a little bit about the future. Today, RuboCop surprisingly has over 30 million downloads, so something which I never foresaw. And it has become an integral part of the Ruby community, something which I completely didn't foresee. We started out with absolutely no configuration. All of the cops were hard-coded. They didn't have configuration settings. It was just, things are supposed to work like they are described in the Ruby style guide. Today, things are infinitely configurable, so every time I see a cop disabled, I'm like, why the hell? Why don't you just change the configuration to what you need? Because I believe that we support every common way of structuring Ruby code base that exists. I've chosen to go with simple examples. For instance, I often see that people are disabling the string literal scope, but probably they just wanted to change the enforce style. You can limit the area of effect of cops with the standard exclude and include directives supported by all cops. Also, you can put in your code inline instructions for RuboCop, whether to change the configuration for some bit of code or something like this, which I think is pretty cool. You can have some really crazy things with your settings. For instance, almost nobody knows that if you have different configuration files of RuboCop at different depths in your project, the one that is closer to the file being parsed is going to overwrite the primary configuration. And this allows you, for instance, to have one set of configuration for your entire application, but a different, maybe more relaxed set for your specs. For instance, in specs, probably you don't care about things like block length. You probably don't care about line length that much and so on. So you can relax them, which is, I think, better than just disabling them. But you can also disable them for part of the code, enable them for other, without having to deal with complex inclusion-exclusion patterns, which is pretty cool. You can also set a target Ruby version and a target Rails version for RuboCop, and this is going to overwrite your current Ruby version, and it is going to use some different parser. If you have a library that has to work on Ruby 2.1 plus, you can't just be using checks for Ruby 2.5. This is going to be kind of bad. And this allows you this flexibility, the same thing about different versions of Rails, because there are different practices at play for them. You can inherit between configuration files, and this means that you can modify the configuration for your organization's projects, and you can just share it as gems and use the command bits. It's pretty cool. You can auto-generate an initial config for RuboCop. Many people wonder, how do I deal with the boatload of offenses I have to fix in the beginning? Well, usually what I suggest is you run one autocorrect to see everything that can be autocorrected. You run your specs to see that they still pass. And then you run auto-gen config, which is going to generate a configuration that doesn't generate any offenses. And from them, basically, it's going to disable all the cops that are producing offenses for you. So you can, one by one, eliminate the problems in your code that are remaining. This is very easy to trigger. And one of our contributors has pushed this further with the gray gem that's not very familiar, but it is quite handy. You can actually intelligently detect the primary code style of your code base, and you can simply work towards enforcing it. RuboCop also grew much beyond its original scope. It was supposed to be just a code style checker, and now we have something like 11 cop departments. I think that some that are really interesting are, for instance, performance, the metrics, security, and so on. But also the split in departments means that RuboCop is not just a linter, it's also the missing code formatter for the Ruby ecosystem. If you run this command, RuboCop only layout, the only thing that RuboCop is going to do, plus an autocorrect, that this is going to reformat your entire code. It's not going to run any other types of checks. And I don't know, I think that this is pretty useful. I also think that RuboCop became a better baseline linter than Ruby itself, because the linting department of RuboCop is a bit more sophisticated, significantly larger, and it produces meaningful error messages, warning messages. You just run RuboCop lint, and this is the best RuboCop -W you can ever get. So what I'm trying to say is that RuboCop is not an all-in. You don't really need to be using it for all possible use cases, but it can be pretty useful for you in some with a subset of its functionality. You can also extend RuboCop with your own custom cops, which I'm not going to speak about because it is pretty well documented in our manual. But basically, you invoke one command which generates the skeleton of cop class. Cops are checkers. You write a bit of code that it's not complex at all, and is very well documented, very well for real, not for a random definition of very well, and you're done. This is extremely useful for organizations that have certain frameworks, tools that they developed in-house, and they want to enforce consistency there. For instance, the Granite framework started as an internal TopTal project. We were using this on all of our bigger Rails code bases, and we have a huge library of custom cops that are checking for Granite best practices, which I guess we should also open source. I know that, that there is a potential for Trailblazer specific checks and so on. And even now we have a rich ecosystem of extensions, many of which are just bundles of custom checks. I was really surprised when I searched on Ruby gems for RuboCop to see that there are something like 189 gems somehow tied to RuboCop. This is really flattering. It means that me and the team worked on something meaningful, that there are many extensions that are popular in the community. RuboCop RSpec is undoubtedly the most sophisticated bundle of checks outside of RuboCop's core as well. There is a great integration with Guard, that there are checks for things like SQL, Cask, etc. Obviously, RuboCop bundles checks for things like Rails, and I can imagine that somebody is doing checks for Hanami and so on, which is cool. Also, a lot of popular code quality services provide out-of-the-box integration, and Site CI also provided a lot of support with the development of RuboCop. One of their full-time employees has done a ton of work on RuboCop, and for this, I'm really grateful to Site CI. We are right now at a point where every notable editor and IDE has some decent integration with RuboCop. I was particularly proud when I saw that IntelliJ JetBrains decided to bundle the integration with RuboCop directly with RubyMine. That's cool. But you can read all about this in the manual, which is quite extensive, and I believe that most people have never heard of and never opened. And it depresses me that I spent so much time writing it, and people missed it. I'd like to highlight just one more gem before I wrap this section, and this is MRAI. MRAI stands for Migrate RuboCop YAML. This is a very handy gem that updates your configuration between RuboCop releases in case we change the names of some cops, settings, whatever. You just run MRAI and magic happens. Probably at some point this should become a part of RuboCop itself, but now it is an interesting standalone idea. And to wrap it up, a glimpse into the future of RuboCop. The number one question that I usually get asked is, when are we getting a stable release of RuboCop? This mystical 1.0 release that has all the features, none of the bugs, and is never going to break my CI build. That's a pretty tall order, so I don't think we're getting it anytime soon, but I can tell you what has to happen for us to get it. Number one thing, before the release of 1.0, I want us to remove all of the Rails checks and all of the performance checks from RuboCop's core for two reasons. Number one, I don't want to have any framework-specific checks in the core. And for the performance, I don't want to have any checks that are dependent on MRI, because all of the performance cops are basically derived from MRI characteristics that are changing between versions of MRI. I find this very brittle, and I don't like it. And the second reason, I want to reduce the workload for myself. As many of you know, over the years, I have become highly skeptical of Rails and a vocal opponent of it. I still believe that Ruby has a bright future in front of it, but for this future to exist, it has to be without Rails in it. So my plan is to move RuboCop to an organization and provide the Rails support and the performance cops as separate add-ons for Rails. This is tied to finding the time to provide a stable and proper API for writing extensions, because right now you have to jump through a lot of hoops, mostly because I never really did this essential work. So it is very high on my to-do list. I also want us to review carefully the configuration of all cops to come up with the best defaults. This would entail analyzing all of the configuration files that are publicly available for many projects, seeing what people are tweaking, seeing that things that they're removing. So out of the box, we have a better experience for newcomers, a less frustrating one. This also entails adjusting the list of enabled by default cops, which probably today is a bit bigger than it is supposed to be. We have to agree on what exactly constitutes a breaking change, because I'm not shipping a 1.0 release and then having to issue major releases if I decide to rename a cop or something like this. That there is a lot of, that there are many conflicting opinions in the RuboCop community, how exactly we have to proceed. So we have to reconcile our differences. And in general, until we get to a point where we know that with a reasonable degree of certainty, nothing is going to be breaking for people's builds, and people are still going to see the new functionality available for them. RuboCop 1 is not going to happen. There have been many suggestions to just disable new stuff by default and ensure the stability like this. But I think this is pretty lame, as if you do it like this, likely nobody is ever going to enable nothing new, because nobody reads the changelogs, nobody reads the manuals, and so on. So RuboCop 1 is coming, but RuboCop 1 is going to require a lot of work that I can never do myself. Years ago, an ape, Caesar, taught us that apes together strong. And I believe that Ruby is together strong as well. So with your help, with the help of more Rubyists around the world, RuboCop 1 may happen, may. It's not certain that it's going to happen, but I also don't think that we need it that much. It's something that would be amazing, but even in its present form, RuboCop is adding, I guess, more value than friction. Otherwise, none of you would be using it. So that's all from me. It was a pleasure to be here. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Bozhidar.